There are many people out there who say that the interactions between the colonists and the Indians were, well, mostly negative. I am actually here to give you the good and the bad because there was lots of good and bad that was committed on both sides. When you take the route that most revisionist historians take, which is to expressly speak on the negative interactions between the Indians and the colonists, you end up with a very skewed view of our history, mostly a negative view to undermine the founding of our country. And I want to be very, very clear on where I stand. I am not here to say that all of the interactions between the colonists and the Indians were on the up and up. That's not what I'm trying to do. In fact, there were many things that were wrong that the colonists did, but I am not here to just simply lay the fault only on the Indians and simply to lay the fault only on the colonists either. There were many atrocities that were committed at the hands of the Indians as well as the colonists. Of course, history would back up my claim as to the negative interactions that took place on both sides, but also a quick look at our human nature, which I believe our human nature is fundamentally flawed due to our sin nature. Uh, but because of that, we are very prone to make mistakes on both sides. The last point that I would like to make is that the content of this video is for the purpose that leads up to the French Indian War. This is leading up to that relationship that was there. There may be some bleeding over into the post revolutionary era, and maybe a little bit before the Trail of Tears. But I will get into that in a later video, detailing more of that of the bad interaction of what had happened there. But just know this, that there were many people who decried the Trail of Tears as an act of evil, that Andrew Jackson just flat out ignored the Supreme Court and started the Trail of Tears anyway. Speaking of which, I wonder what party he belonged to. Anyway, according to William Osborne, on the wild frontier, atrocities during the American Indian War from Jamestown Colony to Wounded Knee, death that was caused specifically by settler atrocities from 1623 to 1890 totaled 7,193 deaths. So some quick math would calculate this to a 267-year time span with 7,193 murders that would calculate to about 27 murders per year, or about a weekend in Chicago. Keep in mind, I am not excusing this behavior. I think the action on this is completely reprehensible and evil. Also, keep in mind that this was not a yearly basis. Most of these deaths would have happened in clusters. However, making the colonists seem like they were perpetually rapacious is historically false. On the other hand, from the years 1511 to 1879, deaths that were caused by atrocities by the Indians, and this included Indian on Indian crime, totaled 9,156, which calculates to 368 years and about 24 deaths a year. Again, this was not a yearly occurrence, but this would happen in clusters. This does not take into account the wars that were fought or the Trail of Tears or any other type of death, for example, or by sickness. But this primarily focuses upon the atrocities that were committed by one group against another. Osborne defines atrocities as, quote, an atrocity as a murder or torture of civilians or prisoners. Russell Thornton even concluded that the Indian Wars that were fought in individual conflicts, not on government-sanctioned wars from 1775 to 1890, was around 5,000 whites that died and 8,500 Indians that died. That included men, women, and children. Government-sanctioned wars in the same time frame puts the death totals at 14,000 whites and 30 to 45,000 Indians who perished. According to Jeff Flynn Paul in his book Not Stolen, quote, specialists know that the massacres and other deliberate acts of violence accounted for less than 1% of the Indian population decline, with a mere 10 to 20,000 Indians falling in European instigated massacres over 4 centuries of English and American colonization. Out of an overall population of millions, it is difficult to blame the massacre for the fact that the Indian populations did not recover. The real reason the Amerindian population east of the Mississippi was already so small by 1800 was not due to the theft of Indian land or genocidal policies, but due to a combination of more mundane factors. First, the inefficiency of hunting and gathering. Second, the Amerindian susceptibility to disease. Third, Amerindian aggression by the likes of the Iroquois, which reshaped Amerindian society from within and made population replacement difficult. And fourth, was gradual assimilation into the farming society. Often, the Indians would set up trading posts and would jockey for positions to be the middleman between the newly arrived white settlers and the other Indian tribes in the area. This would lead to trading posts as well as settlements being established so that they could live close to the Europeans. The Europeans craved land. The natives craved these European items to help them gain an advantage over their enemies, which would actually be other tribes. They also desired the same thing and grew jealous. This jealousy would fan the flames of war for both the natives and the newly arrived Europeans. For example, the Pequot War was started because the Dutch arrived in Connecticut and set up the Pequot Indian tribe, who was benefiting from the trade with the Dutch. And they took most of the middlemen positions, and this gave them the leverage to subjugate the other tribes throughout Connecticut. Of course, this just fostered resentment among the subjugated tribes. Once the British arrived in the early 1630s, this shifted the power balance away from the Pequot, who were dealing mostly and exclusively with the Dutch. The other tribes, who had been subjugated by the Pequot, now found themselves with a new advantage that was once almost exclusive to the Pequot tribes: the European technology. The result was, quote, the arrival of the English in the Connecticut River Valley resulted in intense competition and conflict for control of trade, and tribes wrested themselves from Pequot subjugation, resulting in the outbreak of the Pequot War. The primary cause of this war was for control of the trade. The Dutch-Pequot alliance wanted to maintain their dominance, and the English looked to break their control over the fur and wampum trade. On the other hand, you have the other tribes who were growing with increasing resentment toward the Pequot Indians, looking to break themselves from the Pequot domination. So, in other words, you have tribes who are already at each other's throat, looking for an excuse to fight. And when the British and the Dutch arrived, they were given that excuse. Once the British traders were murdered, this just ignited the already existing resentment and hatred and tension, resulting in the Pequot War. The Beaver and the Fox Wars followed the same recipe for disaster. We know, and mostly because it's been shoved down our throats, of the English defrauding the natives, but is the reverse true? Absolutely. After a few years of commerce and exchange, the English, though they were in a relatively good relationship with the Powhatan tribe, despite previous years of turmoil between them, after Chief Powhatan had died, his brothers, Optachampum and Optachankanu, took over, and neither of them were inclined to allow the advances of the European civilization on land nor the increasing population. On March 22nd, 1622, the Powhatan tribe, led by Optachankanu, posing as friends, entered into the settlements along the James River and, with a signal, attacked and killed men, women, and children in the settlements, killing 347 Europeans, effectively slaughtering a quarter and according to some other historians, about a third of the population of the English in the colony of Virginia. This massacre led to the Second Anglo-Powhatan War. This gave the English the idea that the natives had to be conquered. In May of 1623, William Tucker held peace negotiations with the Powhatan tribe. In the final toast, he poisoned the drinks of the Indians, which sickened more than 200 Powhatans, and then ordered the English to fire upon the Powhatans, killing several of them. Not a good thing from the English either. After several years of fighting, the two had fought to a draw by 1632. However, with the English gaining more of an upper hand, with more and more colonists arriving from England, 1632, both sides agreed to a peace treaty, albeit a very shaky one. By 1644, Chief Opechancanough led another surprise attack on the English, killing another 400 settlers, but by this time the English had a population of over 8,000 along the James and York rivers. So it wasn't as grievous as a blow as the last surprise attack had been in 1622. Nevertheless, this enraged the English, and the Third War commenced. By 1646, the English captured Opechancanough and brought him over to Jamestown. He was put on display, and within 2 weeks he was murdered by one of his guards. Necotowance became the next chief, and his attitude toward the English was radically different from his predecessor, who hated the English. Necotowans pledged for the Powhatan to never, quote, wrong the English in any kind, but that they would hold love and friendship together. Many of the Powhatan descendants still live in Virginia to this day. The Cotton War in 1636 Cotton War in 1636 through 1637 only started a month after raids on the forts of Connecticut, and only after the Indians began killing women and children at Wethersfield did the colonists finally retaliate, which resulted in the Mystic Massacre. John Mason, with a force of 77 Connecticut militia and 250 native allies, attacked and massacred the Pequot stronghold, killing between 300 and 700 Pequot Indians and selling 60 of them into slavery. King Philip's War from 1675 through 1676 was the bloodiest war waged pre-revolution. There was a great excerpt that I'm going to pull from the Harvard veterans to explain the situation of this war. Quote, to find the cause of King Philip's War, we go back to the powerful epidemic of 1616 through 1619. Because the population loss among the fighting age members of the Wampanoag people, they were vulnerable to attack from their traditional enemies, the neighboring Narragansett nation, who had suffered far less during the epidemic. When the Plymouth colonists arrived from England in 1620, the leader of the Wampanoag Confederation, Massasoit, had a critical choice to make. Some of the lesser chiefs among the Wampanoag tribal groups called for Massasoit to overpower and annihilate the Pilgrims with warriors. Because of decades of exposure to European explorers, the chiefs believed nothing but death, destruction, and enslavement would result from allowing the colonists to live among them. As chief of the Wampanoag people, Massasoit faced a more pressing problem, the threat of attack and subjugation by the Narragansetts. Instead of acquiescing to the dissenting Wampanoag chiefs, he built a strategic alliance with the Pilgrims to counter the Narragansett threat. Fast forward 4 decades to when Philip became the leader of the Wampanoag Confederation. The colonists, by 1670, had intermingled with Philip's people, taking more and more land since first beginning their alliance with the Wampanoag decades before. A frustrated Philip weighed the pros and cons of continuing the alliance. He decided that the colonists' hunger for the Wampanoag land would never abate, which would lead his people to landlessness, servitude, and subjugation. A man by the name of John Sassaman, who had been converted to Puritanism, began establishing praying towns in Indian Territory. He would often serve as an interpreter between Metacom, or King Philip, and the English, and as the English kept expanding, King Philip grew increasingly frustrated and thought that there would be no end. The other chiefs believed that John Sassaman reported details of the meetings between the chiefs to the English governor Edward Winslow. One day, on a trip to get back home, Sassaman never made it back home and died at the Assawamsett Pond. The actual cause of the death was unknown, but many of the English believed that it was murder by the hands of the Indians. 3 of King Philip's men were arrested and tried in the English colonist court of law, and there was an existing agreement that would require each person to be tried by their own people for their crimes, but the English tried the 3 men anyway and sentenced them to death and hanged them. This enraged King Philip, and by 1675 he led a surprise attack on the English settlements. By the end of the war in 1676, many of the English settlements had been burned and destroyed, and resulted in 2,500 deaths, or nearly 1/3 of the total English population in New England. And about 5,000 natives were killed by war, starvation, and disease. Another 1,000 were sold into slavery to the Caribbean. And lest you think that the Europeans were the only slave owners, please think again. The Indians had practiced slavery long before they set eyes upon the first white man and were perfectly fine with selling the vanquished tribe into slavery. I'm going to quote Jeff Finn Paul here once again. Quote, both the Powhatan War of Virginia and King Philip's War in New England were calculated gambles on the part of the powerful chiefs who hoped to deal a knockout blow to the English, thereby driving them from their territories forever. This was similar to how Indian chiefs dealt with neighboring tribes with whom they had a major grievance. When they believed they had sufficient military advantage, the responsibility for the decision to go to war often lay with the individual chiefs, and the logic they used to make sense within the context of their social milieu. According to Kathleen Duvall in her book The Native Ground, Indians and Colonists in the Heart of the Continent, she points out more than 20 generations have come and gone since the days of Christopher Columbus. Out of those 20 generations, only 2 generations are responsible for the majority of the land grab. No generation since the 1890s has stolen land in a significant way, and no single generation before 1830 stole more than a tiny fraction of the land from the natives. Many of the generations were unable to tame the interior of the land, mostly due to technological limitations. Until the mid 19th century, most European settlements in different countries stuck to the coasts. Inventions such as the locomotive, which helped facilitate travel and the transportation of goods, which in turn would allow the European settlers to penetrate deeper into the land. Again, my focus is on the colonists. I will get into the land grab at a later date. We also see that the Europeans, although not always upheld, held a reluctant respect for the Indians' land rights. The European courts gave the Indians some redress in court against the white land surveyors. In other areas, such as with the Dutch, the administrator would make it a point to gain the land in the Hudson River Valley through trade and to respect the boundaries of the Indians. The French and the British also had policies of respecting the boundaries of the Indians. This can be seen even as late as 1745 when the Albany Congress met with the Mohawk tribe to solidify relations. This helped lead the British. This actually eventually led to the British Proclamation of 1763 after the Seven-Year War, which forbade the Anglo-American colonists from settling on the land acquired from the French after the war. You have examples again of the Georgians who wanted to keep the peace with the local tribe for fear of them being used by the Spanish or the French against them. You have Pennsylvania, which was mostly acquired through fair trade. You also have Pennsylvania, which was mostly acquired through fair trade and deals, as long as William Penn was alive. Of course, you have the opposite, where his sons defrauded the Lenape tribe through trickery. For every bad example, you could also find good examples of the colonists purchasing the land fairly. There are many bad examples that you can find existing on both sides defrauding each other, both sides killing each other, both sides committing heinous acts against each other. The European settlers did not have a monopoly on being a douchebag. We have seen many of the interactions between the Indians and the Europeans in this video, and we could see that the Indians were also guilty of many acts of malice as well. Clear that I did cover quite a bit of the negative on the Indian side, but there were many good examples too. We have Squanto, Pocahontas, the first Thanksgiving with the Wampanoag. There were also many interracial marriages, which is evidenced by the fact that most of the natives today are of mixed blood. Also, had one side been overly rapacious to the other, there would have been more of an effort to either separate or fight more wars than were actually fought. There were also many alliances that were forged between both people, often to the advantage of both sides. For example, other Indian tribes who had been fighting long before the Europeans had ever set foot in the New World. This was a complicated time that cannot be boiled down to just simply white man bad, or it can't be boiled down to Indian bad either. There were certainly injustices that were carried out by both sides. There was certainly a lot of good that was done as well. Peace was forged for long periods of times. Misunderstandings would throw that peace out of whack when a new generation would arise. The Indians kept making pacts and treaties with the newly arrived Europeans, and the Europeans would likewise make pacts and treaties with them. This was not to say that none of those treaties were ever violated, but there was an effort to try. Eventually, this culminated in certain tribes becoming more comfortable or tolerable with certain Europeans. As in the Revolutionary War, we can see, for example. We see the example of the Oneida and the Tuscarora, who had joined with the Americans, and the Cherokee Nation, which had split factions that supported both sides of the war. The other primary example is that of the French-Indian War, otherwise known as the Seven-Year War. The French were supported by the Algonquin-speaking tribes, and the British Americans were supported by the Iroquois Confederacy. More on this in 2 more videos. However, I wanted you to see that this was a far more complex matter and that there was a lot more to it than what revisionist historians like to let on. It goes much deeper than just one side wronging the other. I know that this is not a complete look at the complex relationship that existed between the two peoples, but I hope that with the links that I supplied you, down below in the description that you'll take some time to read and that you too will also come to the understanding that I have. Or at the very least, I hope that through the reading that you'll at least come to the conclusion that not all the interactions between both peoples were evil. I hope that you'll be able to at least walk away with this with a little bit more understanding that it was a very complex situation with two new groups of people dealing with each other. But you let me know what you think down in the comments below, and please keep it respectful, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.